So, okay, so I define ethno-nationalism specifically as right-wing. So I do think that black nationalists, even if they claim to be on the left, they are actually on the right. They just don't realize it. Okay,
Okay,
that's
I mean
my
that's fair. That's fair. So
right.
like,
So, but
how
do
do you
you,
feel about how do you feel about like Thomas Sankara then? Guys like that.
Hitler, I would consider him personally, he's completely right-wing moral intuitions. He's just hyper concerned with defense. He's hyper concerned with rooting out degeneration and subversion, and everything else is kind of like, however, it's just like a means to get to that point. And some people get very upset when I do this. I consider that ethno-nationalism is just definitionally right-wing.
You think so?
Yeah.
So
you
you
get
have
upset
like,
because there's a lot of racists on the left,
yeah, because you
which is
definitely get
Yeah,
like,
but you
hard
can be
to deny.
racist and not be an ethno-nationalist.
so you think like, man, because there's definitely a formulation of the left that includes like black ethno-nationalists.
Yeah, but see, that's so the way that I conceptualize, it's interesting because if you talk about like the racists on the left, there's two types of racists on the left. There are generally non-white people that are racist against white people, and there's white people that are racist against white people, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And so I think to me, it's very clear in how I define left and right, because I always say that the right is xenophobic and the left is xenophilic. That if you're a white person and you're racist against white people, that firmly puts you on the left under my definition. You're xenophilic. Right?
Okay.
Do you have a problem with that framing? So are we only going to talk about like
I mean,
the
not
racism
necessarily, but not necessarily. It's just that there's like arguing over what left or right wing is. It doesn't really lead you. It doesn't really help
Well,
that
no,
much, you know?
we
I
would
think
present evidence. Like obviously, people on the left, they're into they're trotters of the world. Like they're
Right.
into travel and stuff like that. Someone who's a conservative would probably stay home and just raise a family, right? I mean, that seems to be pretty pervasive in every culture around the world. Correct?
I think yes, I agree. And I think the reason I think there's usefulness in the left-right distinction is because now this could be just a trick because we're wired to see patterns, or maybe there aren't. But it seems to me that there are generally two modes of thought in terms of governance.
Totally.
And the two modes of thought that I've laid out are, there's the idea that we should be appealing to tradition, that the answers exist in our past, and that there's always some kind of external force coming into our currently good society trying to subvert it and degenerate it down to be something bad. And I consider that the right-wing idea. And then the left-wing idea is that our traditions, our current system is oppressive and it's destroying us, and we need to dismantle it and destroy it and look out to new ideas and new people that exist outside the system to kind of come in and build something new. And it seems to me that this kind of like, and that's a kind of complicated way of saying change versus tradition. And I know that well, let me just finish. I know that there are a lot of like, every political ideology is going to be more complicated than just change versus tradition. But to me, it does seem like those are the moral intuitions which everything else is kind of based upon.
Change versus
I would just a little difference there, Sitch. I would describe it as exploratory mode versus fortress mode.
Explore versus defend.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah,
I would say the conservative is obviously defend, fortress, build traditions, build a defensible nest for the community.
So what's interesting about that though is that like
liberal would be explore the world, discover new things, bring them back to the community.
Adam, you got to put my face back up since I'm here now. I finally
you're
arrived.
Right. Yeah, what the heck?
So the thing is, what's kind of interesting about that is that would make some leftists right now very right wing because they purity spiral, and purity spiraling is definitely a form of fortressing.
Well,
yes, but the core philosophy that they're operating under is still tradition. The tradition that we're fighting against in society is bad, right? That
so
we
the thing
need
is
to go and get rid of this kind of dominant hierarchy that's oppressive.
There's definitely something to this, but you guys know Hannah Arendt?
No.
No? Okay. Great writer. You should definitely read Origins of Totalitarianism. Excellent book. All right. But she famously quoted as saying, every socialist becomes a conservative after the revolution, right?
Right.
Because once your revolution becomes not the counterculture, but the dominant mode of politics in your country, you do want to conserve it.
Well, then it's
Right.
tradition.
At first.
Yeah, then it becomes a tradition, yes.
Right.
But then, like, if, you know, what was the Soviet Union left wing?
Yes.
But they had, at that point, socialism was the tradition of their country, and they were conserving it.
Right. So
they were operating it in a right wing way.
Right.
By your definition.
But wait a minute. It depends how long this all goes, because, and like, here's part of the issue too, because when I kind of lay out these left-right things, like, obviously people and ideologies exist on a spectrum. Like there's going to be the person or the ideology that exists as like the pure leftist ideology. Like, literally, we need to have a revolution every 20 years, you know, kind of Jeffersonian idea. And then, or there's going to be we need to go back to monkey, right wing ideas. Like, obviously, there's going to be these endpoints, but most people don't exist on these endpoints. They exist somewhere in the middle, and even then, there's going to be a mix of a bunch of different things. And the way that I conceptualize it is, what is like the root thing that's motivating the principal behavior that everything else is then built upon?
Yep.
And so you do get in the situation where it's true that once you have a revolution, like a communist revolution, once that revolution exists and then exists long enough, it will switch. The left-wing people will be against communism, and the right-wing people will be in favor of maintaining communism. And we've literally seen this with liberalism, right, and capitalism, because that used to be the left-wing view. That was literally the left-wing view, was the Enlightenment and liberalism and capitalism. And now most people that you talk to in America, they literally define right wing as libertarian, even though and that's why the NRXers get so mad, and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? Right wing is monarchy. You guys are full of shit.
Yeah.
And there is going to kind of be this forever, because the way that, like, I define it is change versus tradition, or explore versus defend. There will always be a forever changing. It's not going to be set in stone what ideology the left and the right stands for.
Yeah. So for example, like, if you were to ask a left winger, what is left versus right? Well, they're going to say, well, obviously, you know, the Democrats are going to be like center right, and the Republicans are going to be right wing, and then you're going to have the fascists and the far right, and then on the left you have the socialists, and then you have the communists, and finally, you know, the anarchists. There's your left-right spectrum. It's anarchy versus order. Okay. If you ask like a right winger what is left versus right, they're going to do something that's more like collectivism versus individualism. So on the right you have libertarianism, and on the left you have both communism and fascism, because they're both collective ideologies, right? Then if you ask like a reactionary, well, what is left right? A reactionary will say, well, monarchy is obviously right wing, and left wing is liberalism and socialism and fascism, because they're all post Enlightenment. Right. So this is why I don't like right and left, because everyone has a different spectrum that they're measuring.
But that's the point, is to find some objective measure that we can all stick to, and the people who make up their own measure are wrong.
Well, sure, but I mean, you can also just talk about the ideologies themselves, right? Like, it doesn't matter whether fascism is left wing or right wing based on whatever scale you're using. What matters is that when we say fascism, we're talking about fascism.
Right.
Yeah, but I do. Right. No, and I agree. But my point with this in the left right thing is not to demonize or lionize anyone. I just think that there is an interesting psychological truth that underpins human behavior that can, broadly speaking, be kind of divided into twain. Yeah. And I think that's to me, that's what's interesting.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I don't disagree. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, to go back a question you asked, what, like, the Nazis were syncretic, right? A lot of the neo-fascists from like the second fascist period, they were mostly syncretic. So, like, Franco, his politics were syncretic. And Salazar in Portugal, he was syncretic. You look at Chile, he was syncretic. Right. Romania, Japan, they were all syncretic politics.
If the Nazis, so I define ethno-nationalism specifically as right wing. So I do think that black nationalists, even if they claim to be on the left, they are actually on the right. They just don't realize it. Okay.
Okay, I
That's
mean
my
that's
right.
fair. That's fair. So
Right.
like,
So, but
how do you
you,
feel about how do you feel about like Thomas Sankara then, guys like that?
I don't know who that is.
Okay, here. It's Wikipedia Thomas Sankara, and just like read off the first. It's a 4-line paragraph. It's not much there. All right.
Can you just tell us?
Sure, I can, but I mean, sure, just all right. So, Thomas Sankara was a Burkinabe military officer, a Marxist revolutionary,
Hmm.
and a Pan-Africanist who served as the president of Burkina Faso from his coup in 1983 to his assassination in 1987.
Right.
He is viewed by supporters as a charismatic and iconic figure of revolution. So, the left claims this guy, all right? They claim him hard. They love Sankara because
Right.
he's one of like the he's one of the only successful Marxist revolutionaries in Africa. But like looking back on him now with a more objective eye, he was absolutely a fascist because he
Hmm.
was not only a Marxist in his economics, he was 100% like a black nationalist.
Right. So the way that
And
I,
you find a lot of people like that in like the history of leftist revolutions. There's tons of nationalists in there.
right. No, no, no. I know. And that's kind of what makes the conversation interesting to me. Because the way that I look at it and my thought process is what is the seed that's motivating the behavior? So, like with this guy, with old Tommy here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is his prime, like, is this because, and maybe this is what we should start with from, because me and Adam believe, since we're big hype boys, we
Mm-hmm.
believe that essentially for everyone, including Thomas, including Hitler, including all these people, there's some moral intuition that comes first and that motivates their thought process. And then the philosophy or the ideology they come up afterwards is kind of like the post hoc rationalization to justify this moral intuition, which we talked about on Sunday to some extent.
Yes.
And this kind of leads into, the whole philosophy versus psychology thing, because this is kind of how I view the world. So when I look at like what is left or right, especially when you have these figures that seem to have contradicting principles, I'm looking for what is the core moral intuition that's guiding the behavior in the first place. And that's how I'm defining whether it's left or right. And so like Thomas here, now I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this question, but I would say with him personally, I'd say what was the motivating core factor? Was the first factor that I want to have an ethno-nationalist country first and foremost, and then he's like, then he's convinced or whatever thinks that socialism is going to be the best way to maintain the ethno-nationalist country. Because if that was the case, I'd say, well, then he's right wing. But if he says, I want to have a socialist country, that's the core principle he's coming from. And then after that, he says, well, I think the best way to maintain the socialist country is ethno-nationalism. Then I would say that he's on the left.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay. Well, there also might just be like a practical concern, right?
Mhm.
Because even if you might ultimately have, let's say, left-wing moral intuitions, the fact that you have to work within the frames of existing nations and their
Right.
governments and their
That's
power
true.
structures, you might have to be a nationalist, not because you actually want to be a nationalist, but because it's the only way forward.
No, that's a really good point. Yeah, because I don't know if this is known about this guy, but yeah, he could be totally have all the left-wing moral intuitions, but everyone else has very ethno-nationalist intuitions already pre-established in the culture, and so he just has to exist within that framework.
Well, that's kind
Yeah.
of baked into your thought experiment, though. Obviously, like if
Right.
he has the ethno-nationalist moral intuitions, but perceives the environment being receptive to Marxism and adopts Marxism just from a pragmatic perspective. I mean, that's
Right.
part of what you're
Exactly.
saying. Yeah.
Right.
Well,
So if
I
he's
think it's also
adopting it
because
pragmatically, he's not, he's not necessarily left wing.
I also think it's because when we're talking about the third world, like we're talking about Africa, to a lesser extent South America,
Mhm.
I think there's an understanding there that these are kind of the same thing, that the socialism and the nationalism are one and the same, because they're colonized countries, right? They're like former colonies, colonial powers of Europe were once ruled over them. And also nowadays you have neocolonialism, which is the World Bank, the IMF coming in with all of their foreign dirty money to pollute our country, right?
Right.
And like and exploit us and extract our resources away from us, right? So there's so much overlapping between nationalism and socialism in the third world specifically because of the history
But
of the third world.
not as a philosophy,
I'm not sure.
though.
Well, maybe as a philosophy.
How?
Well, what do you mean? I mean, it's just
Nationalism is just the idea of building a shared culture within a nation. Socialism is the idea of how to distribute resources between the people of a nation. Like, it's a completely different philosophy.
Well, if the history of your nation is being economically exploited by foreign powers, it would seem to be the case that how you distribute the resources of the nation is going to play into your nationalism.
Yeah, definitely.
Sure, but at the same time, you're still talking about two distinct philosophies. You can
Well,
have a nationalist philosophy that is completely devoid of socialism, obviously.
Oh yeah,
right,
of
but
course you
they're
can. Of
not
course you can.
necessarily conflicting. Like you can have, well, it depends because obviously there's elements of
Well, I mean,
socialism that would be
yeah.
conflicting because there's the idea of like class solidarity among the world, which would conflict. But you can definitely, and I think maybe this is kind of a key thing and kind of the messiness of these philosophies, as you're saying, Dev, that we have to remember a lot of the political governments and political ideologies that exist, they have to do a lot of pragmatic considerations, and so
Hmm.
there's going to be a lot of like there's going to be a lot of I guess ideological agreements or ideological giving into certain things that maybe the leader doesn't really care about or agree with. Like I mean I haven't read Mein Kampf. Okay, I've read selections of Mein Kampf. I've read selections of Hitler's uh,
Table talks.
table talks and things of that nature.
Hmm.
But whenever I've read the Hitler's words, I don't see him super talk about extolling the virtues of like socialist economic theory,
Yeah.
Right.
right?
So
Like
there's
he
like
seems to be really concerned with the idea of like a German spirit, a German bloodline that is being
mhm.
degenerated from the outside. That seems to be his primary
So
motivation.
yes,
Megalothumia
Yeah.
is what that's called.
yeah. So the people in the Nazi Party who were much more interested in the economics of it, those were the Strasserites,
Right.
right? And they had their civil war, and the Strasserites lost. So it was Hitler's vision of the Nazi Party that ultimately won out, and not the Strasser brothers.
Right.
So, like Hitler had to keep the loyalty of certain factions of the party that were more explicitly socialist,
Hmm.
but he ultimately was not ideologically devoted to socialism
Right.
the same way the Strasserites were, because the
Right.
Strasserites they were truly national socialists. Like
Right.
they were straight up socialism for one nation. We want this type of economy. We want this type of state structure. Like they were all in,
Hmm.
those guys.
Well, see, but
And in
that's
fact,
very
there was
interesting.
like one of the Strasser brothers wrote a book while he was in exile before the Second World War started, but after he was kicked out of Germany, where he basically outlines the difference between what he wanted for Germany and what Hitler's doing.
Right.
And you can see like there actually are serious differences between the two of them
Were they
because
very motivated by the ethnic idea too?
they were, but they were
Hmm.
also very motivated by the socialist idea.
Okay, interesting.
They were anti-Semitic, but
Hmm.
only because they viewed anti-Semitism as a core necessary component of anti-capitalism.
Like
It was
Marx.
yes, yeah. They were directly inspired by Marx, where Marx is like,
Right.
listen, to abolish capitalism, we must abolish the Jew. The Strasserites viewed it the same way.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, but see, because to me that kind of plays into my thought process is that, Hitler, I would consider him personally, he's completely right-wing moral intuitions. He's just hyper concerned with defense. He's hyper concerned with rooting out degeneration and subversion, and everything
Mhm.
else is kind of like, however, it's just like a means to get to that point.
Right.
Right.
So
So, but
yeah,
right.
if the psychology comes first, then he would just be a right winger. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's why
But
and
yeah,
now that's why I just clearly define the Nazis as right wing because essentially they were existing under Hitler's vision of things.
yeah, yeah. By the end, they were. Yeah.
Right.
Um.
Right.
Well, then again, like there's the psychology, which is very important, but there's also the practical effects of policy, right?
Sure.
And when it comes to the practical implementations of government policy under the Nazis, it was definitely a grab bag of left and right.
Yeah. Well, maybe whenever we talk about this, I should be more specific and say I think the psychology of the Nazis was right wing. I'm not really talking about whatever specific policies were necessarily implemented because you're right, the policies could be all over the place. It's
Yeah.
kind of like I'm really talking about like the psychology and the moral intuitions that were being used by the Nazis to maintain power in the country
Okay.
from the
All right. I understand.
populace. So but it sounds like, I mean, so do you agree that ethno-nationalism should be considered right wing?
Um. I still don't completely agree, but I understand your argument. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I need to consider it a little bit more.
Right. Because if you don't, I'm just curious as to how, well, like, what are, like, why would you define Hitler as right-wing psychologically?
Well, for the reasons you listed out. Like, if we're talking psychology, those seem to be good.
Okay. So
those seem to be good reasons. Yeah.
Right.
If we're talking about, you know, the 6 moral foundations,
right,
for example, if you're going to define it like that, yeah, that makes sense. Yes.
Okay.
Hi, you just listened to a clip from the Sitch and Adams show. If you like what you heard, you can listen to our live show right here on this channel on Sunday, starting at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And if you want, you can super chat us. We read $20 and up super chats on the show and then do a follow-up stream on the following Tuesday where we read the rest of the unread super chats and interact with fans of the show. Subscribe to this channel right here to listen to the live show or to listen to more of our awesome clips.